So great to hear all the good things that are happening across the country. A lot of work still to do, but the leadership from cities and cities and states is really inspiring and encouraging. I want to bring up to the stage two other people who will share more things that are happening across states in this country. One of the great things I think about this conference, we intentionally tried to have a lot of different voices, different experiences, and I think we want to do, this next panel or this next conversation will show the same regarding state progress. Mark Holden serves as a Senior Vice President, General Counsel, and Corporate Secretary of Koch Industries. He's also President and CEO of the Legal Division of Koch Company's Public Sector. Mark chairs the Board of Freedom Partners, Chamber of Commerce, and serves on the Board of Directors for Americans for Prosperity. Mark is one of the foremost champions of criminal justice reform and has supported sentencing reform, prison reform, and reentry efforts across the country. He's joined in this conversation by Bill Keller, Editor-in-Chief of the Marshall Project. Bill worked for the New York Times from 1984 to 2014 as a correspondent, editor, and op-ed columnist. As a correspondent, he covered the collapse of the Soviet Union, winning a Pulitzer Prize at the end of white rule in South Africa. From July 2003 until September 2011, he was executive editor of the Times. Please welcome Mark Holden and Bill Keller.
Let me start by stating the obvious, that criminal justice is one of those rare subjects where even in this polarized country, there's a demonstrable patch of common ground between left and right. You, and when I say you, I actually mean Charles Koch.
Wow, that's great, thank you.
You're a dead ringer for him.
Yeah.
You support sentencing reform, you support rehabilitation reforms in prison, you support a whole lot of things that would win endorsements from the ACLU just as readily, including giving the right to vote to people who've served their time for many crimes. But since President Trump and Jeff Sessions arrived in Washington, the tone has changed, and I'm curious whether that's put a strain on this coalition, and whether this sort of tough on crime tone has trickled down to the states where you do a lot of your work.
Well, I'll just start the first part, and thanks for having me. Good morning, good afternoon, whatever time it is right now. So working with this White House, it's actually been really good, and I give a lot of credit to Jared Kushner for that. We haven't made as much progress as we want yet, but we have made some progress, and I'll talk about that. But you asked me about, is there a different mode, a different mood? Obviously in the campaign, there was a lot of the tough on crime stuff. But if you look at what's actually happening and what we're trying to get done now at the federal level, it's really more the smart on crime, soft on taxpayer approach, which is what's led to the criminal justice reform revolution starting back in Texas in 2007. And so we've got a prison reform bill that went through the House at a vote. It was 360 to 59. And it is based on, get this, data and evidence, not on fear and emotion. Crazy. So it's not like we did with mandatory minimums, which was just who could be tougher and lock them up forever, which is a really dumb policy. And I think we should do away with all mandatory minimums, but I don't have that say. But the prison reform bill is a good bill. It's got a lot of things about rehabilitation in there. They're trying to make it so those who are incarcerated can stay more in touch with their families, the 500-mile rule, so no further than 500 miles from your home or your family based on your risk level and bed space. And there's a lot of other provisions in there as well, including letting outside groups in for programming, which I think is essential. And what we've seen in probably everybody in this audience has seen, is there's been a lot of innovation in how to rehabilitate people over the past 10, 15, 20 years. And I think that we've seen a lot of outside groups really embrace that. And we've seen state systems allow those groups to come in and work with incarcerated people so they get skills and deal with all those other issues, whether it's education, et cetera. So that's going to happen as well. I think at the, went to the Senate, we're hopeful they're going to add some, I say it's minor sentencing reform, but since we've really not done a whole lot of sentencing reform ever at the federal level, I think it'll be really good. It's stalled right now. There's supposed to be a vote, a whip count after the midterms, and then hopefully a vote. And I think, that if it gets to the floor, it'll pass. And so that's one thing. The other thing I'll say real quickly so we can move on, we're also focused on clemencies. You've probably seen some of that with, Alice Johnson was released, which was awesome. I mean, she got a life sentence, and she shouldn't have ever received that, in my opinion, but there's so many other people in the federal system and state systems who need relief. And we've had some meetings on the clemency issue and the clemency process, and I'm heartened that I think that this White House, this administration, it's been disruptive in a lot of ways. Some really good, some not really good. But in this area, I do think that we're going to see changes, hopefully, to the clemency system so it's not run by the Department of Justice, because we know where that ends. I mean, they convicted all these people, and it's really hard for prosecutors or anybody to change their mind on things. And so
Alice Johnson got clemency because she had a celebrity sponsor, Kim Kardashian, who intervened on her behalf. Can you really see a guy who likes the individual power of the presidency as much as this one does, agreeing to systemic reforms that reduce his power and spread it out?
I don't think it'll reduce his power at all. We're talking about the Article 2 power he already has. Mm-hmm. And he doesn't need to go through DOJ. They've put that process in place. And Kim Kardashian is an advocate, and I give her a lot of credit. I don't care who advocates for these issues. I don't care, Republican, Democrat, whatever it is. If they're working and they're trying to get good stuff done, I'm with them. So I'm not going to play those games. You're right, that did draw attention to it, and it's drawn more attention to it, so much so that I really think, hopefully, in the next year or so, we can change the way that the clemency system works. And we've got a lot of people from the left and right in these meetings, like Mark Osler, who's an expert, Rachel Barkow, who's an expert on this. So we've got, I think, people who really, Brittany Barnett, who you might know, that was Alice's lawyer. She's also Chris Young's lawyer, if you know Chris Young's case. I'm hoping he gets clemency soon. There's more and more to come, and I do think that this issue, it plays to every president likes the idea of power, I'm sure. This president does, for sure. But it's really opening his eyes to who goes to prison and for how long in this country, and that's important. So he's starting to see the injustice. And it was after the Alice Johnson commutation is when the president okayed putting the 4 reforms into the Senate side of the bill. So I think he's learning about these issues as he goes along, which is all you can ask for with anybody.
Okay. The Koch network advocates what you call a free market approach to criminal justice reform. Help me understand what that means. Does it mean a larger role for private companies? How does that work?
Excuse me. I don't know if we advocated for the criminal justice system. We think in general free markets are better than a centrally controlled economy. The criminal justice system, for it to be, I don't know how a free market economy would work there. What we want in a criminal justice system is a system that's more just, that enhances public safety for everyone, and that provides second chances for people who pay their debt to society. We believe, we look at it through 3 lenses: the moral case, the constitutional case, and the fiscal case. And the moral case is very easy. You all know it. Brian Stevenson laid it out best. It's a 2-tiered system. The rich and guilty get better deals than the poor and innocent. And, it's a system where we basically, in my opinion, do the exact opposite on all these issues than we should do if we really wanted people to come out better and not do more crime and not be a burden on their families and society. And then there's the constitutional case. Almost 50% of the Bill of Rights deals with criminal justice issues and the rights of the individual, 4th, 5th, 6th, and 8th Amendment, those, in my opinion, those amendments are violated basically every single day. And you know, if you don't have money, you don't have a lawyer, you're going to get run over. And then the last part of it we look at is the fiscal case, and the fiscal case becomes the moral case. And yeah, it's drawn a lot of conservatives to criminal justice reform. And as I like to say, they come for the savings, but they stay for the salvation. I mean, so they see what works. And it started in Texas, and you know, Texas, red state Texas under Rick Perry, and they were going to build a new prison, and instead they decided to not put as many people into prison, divert them, and then also for those who were in prison, start to train them, rehabilitate them. And then look what happened. They've closed 8 prisons, saved $4 billion, and they have a crime rate they haven't seen this low since the 1960s. That's what we want. We want fewer people in prison. We want a smaller criminal justice system, and we think the system needs to be changed from beginning to end. And I mean, I'm talking like asset forfeiture needs to go away. It's unconstitutional. We need bail reform consistent with the 8th Amendment. It needs to be based on risk, not on resources. We need prosecutorial reform. We need to make sure that judges are making the calls on most of these things, all of them, not prosecutors. That's the problem. Our prosecutors have way too much in this system, too much power. They're the prosecutor. They're also the judge, the jury, and the executioner. And we need to stop that. We need to make sure that the 6th Amendment is followed every single day, meaning that people get lawyers who need them. We know more than 80% of the people in the system end up needing some type of court-appointed lawyer, and we just don't have that. It's a constitutional crisis. It's a disgrace, and we let it happen again and again. A lot of states are making progress there. New York's done some things. Mississippi's going to do some things. Michigan has got some reforms, but that needs to be reformed. Sentencing, that needs to be reformed. Then we need to reform the way prisons are run so people come out better. It's about rehabilitation and redemption, not just retribution and punishment. And then lastly, it's going to have back-end reforms as far as collateral consequences. The second prison, where someone gets out, pays their debt to society. In our opinion, consistent with public safety, you should get all your rights back. And that includes voting rights. We're very much on board with the Florida referendum. Hopefully it passes. I think it's Amendment 4 or whatever, on restoring rights of people who have paid their debt to society. It's important because if we don't give everybody back their rights, we treat them as second-class citizens. Don't be surprised when they end up in the system again because they can't get jobs, they can't get loans, they can't be part of our society. So all that needs to happen. And once that happens, maybe it'll be more free market. But we got work to do.
Let's talk a little bit about money. I mean, we all know the analogy that's made that a year in the penitentiary costs as much as tuition to a good college.
Or a bad college, yeah.
Right, or a bad college. But the alternatives aren't free. You talk about rehabilitation, drug treatment, education, job training, housing, all the things that the people who are incarcerated need post-incarceration. California has reduced its incarceration rate by 9%, and its state prison budget is as high as it's ever been. So is it a little bit illusory to say that there's this pot of taxpayer savings at the end of the rainbow?
No, it's real. I mean, I told you what's happened in Texas. South Carolina's closed at least 4 prisons, saved almost $500 million. Michigan's closed 11 prisons, saved hundreds of millions of dollars. It can be done. I think California is probably working through the system. They're the biggest state, right? So they're going to probably have more to deal with. But yeah, these things cost money. But the reality is, we've got to fix the system first, and that, the criminal justice system. But if we did more things on the front end with education and supporting communities and having real jobs and opportunities in some of the communities where a lot of people end up in prison, that would help as well. So all of this stuff costs a whole lot of money. A lot of the states are saving a ton of money now because they've employed these practices, and I think that's the trend. It ends up that people come out, rehabilitated, they can get a job, they have a skill, they're less traumatized. They come out and they're productive members of society. They're with their families. They're an addition, an add to their communities, not a detractor. Keeps law enforcement safer. So yeah, it's expensive. All this stuff's expensive, but we spend, over $250 billion a year on the criminal justice system in this country, over $80 billion a year, on incarceration in this country, and that's 3 to 4 times more per capita than we spend on K through 12 education in this country. And it's all about priorities. I always say this, you are what you eat, you definitely are what you spend. And so if you look at how we're spending our money, we must want to incarcerate people more than educate them. I don't think that's true, and I think that's changing. But it's all very expensive. But we need to spend the money on the front end. You get better results on the back end. In Texas, when they were going to build a $2 billion prison, instead they spent $500 million on rehabilitation programs and beefing up their diversionary programs, and it's saved them now over $4 billion. Smart on crime. That's the way to go.
Are the conservatives who are with you on closing the prisons going to be with you when it comes to putting up money for all these alternatives?
But what I'm saying is when you start to close that down, when you start to decarcerate, when you have, and it's got to be more than that. When I went through all that litany, I forgot to mention the number of laws we have in this country. It's ridiculous. I mean, at the federal level, 6,000 federal criminal laws we don't really know. But we've got too many laws which lead to too many fines and fees and all this other stuff that happens. So when you start to get the system right-sized, which a lot of the states are trying to do more and more of, and the economy picking up helps that as well, which also, it creates a virtuous cycle where people coming out of prison now, for example, in Michigan, at the Hanlon State Prison, where they have this amazing education program and also a vocational village, the folks coming out of prison are getting jobs right away with good jobs, some of them six-figure jobs because they're skilled up. So doing these things, it all makes sense. It saves money. Conservatives are fully on board with this stuff about saving the money part, and I think the left is too, because you have more money left to do other things that need to happen instead of just locking people up and making us less safe. The practices that have worked in the 30-plus states have all shown that you can reduce incarceration rates, you can reduce crime rates, and you reduce the spending on it. And so it's just common sense. I mean, it's ridiculous that you don't do it. The tough on crime stuff is so fake and so phony. Everybody knows it, but they still try to do it. And I think it only works sometimes in elections, definitely at the federal level still, because they're like in a time warp and, you know, everybody, they are. So you got people from these laws were passed in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and the people that passed them are still in power, and they're in their 70s, 80s, and 90s, and trying to get them to change it. But even if it's going to change there, too. And I think hopefully it'll change after the midterms. We'll get at least the prison reform part done.
Okay. The latest Koch initiative is called Safe Streets and Second Chances, and it's studying the reentry experience of inmates in 4 states, I think. What do you hope will come of that?
We hope that it's successful. And that people...
What would success look like?
Success would be people coming out of prison, and once they engage in the programs, having a productive life and transforming themselves. Now, we're in 4 states, and we have a number of partners. So it's Koch Industries, it's the Texas Public Policy Foundation, which is right on crime. We also are partnering with the Charles Koch Institute and Florida State University. And so what we're doing, we're in 4 states, like you mentioned. We're in Texas, we're in Pennsylvania, we're in Florida, and we're in Kentucky. And our goal is ultimately to scale this up so we're much more engaged before they come out of prison, so to speak.
But this is more data gathering than...
It's data gathering, but it's also, yeah, it's data gathering. We need data. I mean, that's what's driven, obviously, the criminal justice reform movement for the past 10, 15 years. It's data and evidence-based. Once you have data and evidence-based, even the most, you talked about Jeff Sessions, I mean, even he sometimes believes that stuff too. When you've got actual evidence that shows that what you're doing makes people safer, costs less money, keeps law enforcement safer, how do you say no to that? So what we're doing is, we're in these 4 states, and we've got about 1,100 or so people total, and we're doing it in prisons in urban areas in these states and in rural areas. And the whole idea is we're going to watch how these individuals do as they come out of prison and follow them in their progress over the next year or so. And our whole idea is, it's probably a moonshot and pie in the sky, but the whole idea, the whole mentality we want to start, we're not starting it, it's happened. A lot of people talk about this, and we're learning from other groups that have done this, but reentry needs to begin day 1 of incarceration. That's the whole idea. The end of the line, when you're in, hopefully will help do that. And what we're doing is, half of the individuals in the program are going to get whatever the state institutions provide in reentry. So whatever those programs are. And I'm sure that'll be a mixed bag. That's kind of how it is everywhere. And the other half are going to get a program that's been set up by our chief researcher. It's Carrie Pettis Davis. She's at Florida State University. She was at Washington University in St. Louis for many years. And she and her team have studied like 100,000 plus different reentry programs, incarceration issues, you name it, over the past decade. And they've got this 5 key models program that they think works. And what they're going to do is half of them, like I said, get ours, half of them get the state's program. We're going to work with local providers because we're not going to do this top-down approach, big government approach, which doesn't work. What we want to do is learn from the individuals in these areas what works in the different nonprofits that are helping people reenter, whatever it is, mental health, drug addiction, skills, whatever it might be, housing. And then we're going to compare notes over the next year or so and see who got better outcomes. That's the bottom line, as far as recidivism, employment, how people's lives are. And we've done the first round of data, and it was just a Q&A, or no, just questionnaires for the individuals who had volunteered. And this goes back to what I've always believed. If you've ever heard me speak before, you always hear the same thing, so you probably remember this. But I worked in a prison when I was younger, and then and there were a bunch of kids I grew up with who were incarcerated, who they wanted to succeed, but once they were in prison, it was over. They couldn't. There was no chance. They had no resources. It was brutal. You couldn't. Once you're in the system, you can't get out. You can't get a job, et cetera. And when another job I had, I was a janitor in a factory outside of my hometown of Worcester. And every day they'd bring in guys from the local work release to augment our crew. And there were about 8 of them, and of the 8 guys, usually at least 6 of them are really good guys, and 2 might be jerks, which is better than the average in people outside in society, in my opinion. So, just saying. But my point is, those guys wanted to succeed too, but there was no way back then. It just wasn't something that we did, or our society did, or definitely our governments weren't doing these types of things. So we've done this first round, and the individuals who are coming out, it's not a surprise to me. They've all had great trauma. I mean, all the stories you all know. A loved one was murdered in front of them. They saw a loved one killed, or they had to handle a dead body. They were, a lot of them, most of them had trauma, violence done to them, et cetera, et cetera. So the story everybody knows, one of the common denominators, which is just heartbreaking, but just the way it is. But the other part is they all had great hope for the future. They want to work more. They want to learn more. They want to practice their faith. They want to have a productive, relationship with another person or people or their families. They want to just be a part of society. They want to be a part of this. None of that is surprising. But the fact that they still believe in that, and these individuals have, been some of them in prison a long time. We don't have any say about who goes into this program. It's all randomized, and we get whoever they give us. So it's all types of offenses. So we're tracking all of that, and we're hopeful over the next year we'll be able to see what is working on our side, what we're doing with these local providers to help people rehabilitate and get back on their feet and have a productive life, and hopefully ultimately transformation. And we're going to compare notes with what the outcomes from the state institutions. And, there's a lot of great research out there on these issues, and from a lot of really, really bright people who I respect a lot. And they do these really long studies, or, a decade and a half plus or whatever. And that's important stuff. But we're going to fail fast and hopefully then succeed fast, because we don't want to wait anymore. I mean, people need help now. And we're hopeful that our program can be part of that discussion going forward, whether it gets folded into what the institutions are doing, or we get in more and more states. We've already got 6 or 7 other states that are interested in being a part of this. The other part of what we have, so we've got, we think, really good research with Carrie and her team. We're also working with Right on Crime. And John Kufos, some of you might know, he was with the New Jersey Reentry Corporation. He's now with Right on Crime. We hired him to work with us. John's an amazing guy, got an amazing story. He's a lawyer, he was in prison, now he's back out. And what John does, he's working on the policy side of it. So whether it's at the federal level with the bills that are going through, he's up there advocating for that. But if there's an issue in a state that we're in, or maybe even if we're not in, if he hears about it, he goes in and advocates and gets it cleaned up. So for example, he was helpful down in Mississippi with some of the reforms they were doing on fines and fees. And he's working in other states. If there's some ridiculous regulation that keeps someone who learned to be a plumber or a carpenter in prison, Then when they get out, they can't get an occupational license because of their criminal record. He'll work to try to get rid of that regulation. So John's part of that team. So we're trying to really get the best in policy, the best in research to get the best outcomes. And like I said, our goal, we'd love to be in all 50 states, whatever that looks like. That's a ways to go. We're in the proof of concept right now, had our first data come in. We're gonna have more probably in another month or so, and we'll just keep going. And it's, you know, we're in it for the long term no matter what, because it's interesting, this whole thing on the federal level and the tough on crime. Everybody understands, I think now, by and large, even the tough on crime crew, whatever that means anymore, that people who are in prison, 95% or whatever are getting out. It's just common sense that we need to have people coming out better than they went in. It's the moral thing to do, but it just makes a lot of sense. So they don't reoffend and don't end up going back into prison, because people, generally speaking, don't get better going back and forth into prison.
I want to pick up on something you mentioned earlier, which is the role of prosecutors, prosecutors' discretion in inflating the population of our prisons. George Soros has an approach to that, which consists of helping identify reform candidates for district attorneys around the country and recruiting them and helping to finance their campaigns. And there have been a number of successes, as you know, St. Louis, Chicago with Kim Foxx and some others. Philadelphia, a couple of the Florida cities. Have you considered doing anything of the kind?
No, not necessarily. We've thought about that issue. We've been mostly focused at the federal level on those issues. But I mean, I think it's great. I think this goes back to we need a lot of acts of Congress and everything else to get some of these laws set up and changed so people can have a chance, or we don't put them in prison for so long. So acts of Congress are important, but it's more, in my opinion, at the local level is where most of the people are in prison anyway, where you can make even a bigger difference. And that's why it's so important from our perspective that people who have paid their debt to society need to come back in and be a part of it, and that's voting. So, you know, they should be voting on these issues locally for district attorney and whatever else. So I think it's a great thing. I think that more importantly even than that is it's beyond even the acts of Congress and the local people that you elect. It's also just citizens helping each other out, and whether it's reentry programs or ban the box if you're an employer like we have for many years, hired people with criminal records, all that's important. But I think what George Soros is doing, and to the extent he's funding that or he's got one of his groups doing it, I think it's great. I think people need to be more engaged and involved in their communities, and that will make the biggest difference if politicians start to hear from people more. It's that old saying they won't see the light till you bring the heat. And the reality is that politics is downstream from culture, and politicians are the biggest followers around. They'll get in front of the parade real quick once they think it's something popular. And this is something that's more and more popular that you can run on now. We did polling for the First Step Act with one of the groups I work for, and it was a 70% issue on average, and that included conservatives. And there are conservatives who now say, this is a plurality of conservatives who are going to be likely voters in the midterms. They will come out and vote for people who are in favor of criminal justice reform. So I think we're past the Willie Horton era. We are from a societal perspective, I think, especially in the States. We now have to do more and more to just end all of that, the way we've been set up for the last 30 years with the system.
We did a story at the Marshall Project back in, I think, 2016 about the Koch industries giving to prosecutorial races, and it turned out that a lot of that money was going to candidates who were tough on crime, but not so tough on environment.
That wasn't us. I mean, we talked about that at the time. I reread the interview. We've never funded any of these local prosecutor races, so I don't know. I love you, but I don't remember that. I'm sorry.
You can look it up, themarshallproject.org.
No, I read the interview. I'm telling you we didn't do it, I promise.
I can't resist asking a question that flows naturally from that, which is Jane Mayer, the Boswell and Bête Noire of the Koch family.
He's going to talk French. I have no idea what he's saying.
She wrote a piece saying that the that Charles Koch's interest in reform is a branding exercise designed to soften the company's image as a polluter.
Something like that.
I don't have any reason to doubt Mr. Koch's sincerity, but is this for Koch Industries, at least in some degree, a matter of commercial self-interest?
Let me answer it this way. If this was a publicity deal, PR stunt, you think I'd be the face of it? I got a face for radio and a voice for print. I mean, so. And if it were, it's the slowest release one probably ever. We're in our 12th or 13th year. So, I love the First Amendment, and Jane Mayer can think whatever she wants to think and obviously write whatever she wants. That's cool with me. But that's not what this is about. The Koch Industries of the world, the Charles Kochs of the world, the Mark Holdens of the world, if we or our kids get in trouble, we'll be okay, right? I mean, we can afford lawyers and all that stuff, but it's everybody else who gets screwed. And it's most everybody in society gets run over by the criminal justice system. Middle class, working class, poor, it doesn't matter. So for us, it's about, whether you believe it or not, making it a better society, making it a society that's more just, a society based on equal rights, second chances, redemption, and a society where people are always out to try to help each other improve their lives. And then once you help someone improve their life, that person goes on and improves someone else's life. And that's what I've seen a lot of in the criminal justice movement and in the different groups we work with, from the ACLU, the Center for American Progress, you name it, we've worked left and right and center. And what really is heartening to me, I always say this, when I do these panels and they've got individuals who've been in the system or formerly incarcerated, everybody is more interested in hearing about them and hearing their stories and seeing them. And I'm talking about people from, all white audiences, whatever else. People gravitate to this once they understand it better. It gets back to Brian Stevenson's thing about proximity. When you're proximate to it, when it's one we're tough on crime, Willie Horton, and you demagogue it, that we get bad outcomes. But when people meet people who have been in the system, it changes them. And that's why I think there should be one more criminal law passed, and that should be that before anybody can pass another punitive criminal justice statute penalty, they need to go visit someone in prison and meet people in prison, because they'd be shocked by it. It changes your mind. That's my point of view.
Thanks. The shot clock has just gone off. I have a bank of zeros here, so we're out of time. Thanks, Mark, for putting up with this.
Thank you.